Yes, Mrs. Weldon, replied the young novice, who would have liked to avoid any explanation on this subject. He also hastened to add, while looking at the old black, "This very night Tom and I discovered his treason, and if he had not jumped on his horse and fled, I would have killed him. So this farm—" "There is neither farm, nor village, nor settlement in the neighborhood," replied Dick Sand. "Mrs. Weldon, I repeat to you, we must return to the coast." "By the same road, Dick." "No, Mrs. Weldon, but by descending a river which will take us to the sea without fatigue and without danger. A few more miles on foot, and I do not doubt." "Oh, I am strong, Dick," replied Mrs. Weldon, who struggled against her own weakness. "I will walk, I will carry my child." "We are here, Mrs. Weldon," said Bat, "and we will carry you." "Yes, yes," added Austin, "two branches of a tree, foliage laid across." "Thanks, my friends," replied Mrs. Weldon, "but I want to march, I will march, forward." "Forward!" exclaimed the young novice. "Give me Jack," said Hercules, who took the child from Nan's arms. "When I am not carrying something, I am tired." The brave Negro gently took in his strong arms the little sleeping boy, who did not even wake. Their arms were carefully examined. What remained of the provisions was placed in one package, so as to be carried by one man. Austin threw it on his back, and his companions thus became free in their movements. Cousin Benedict, whose long limbs were like steel and defied all fatigue, was ready to set out. Had he remarked Harris's disappearance? It would be imprudent to affirm it. Little disturbed him. Besides, he was under the effects of one of the most terrible catastrophes that could befall him. In fact, a grave complication, Cousin Benedict had lost his magnifying glass and his spectacles. Very happily also, but without his suspecting it, Bat had found the two precious articles in the tall grass where they had slept, but, by Dick Sand's advice, he kept them safely. By this means they would be sure that the big child would keep quiet during the march, because he could see no farther, as they say, than the end of his nose. Thus, placed between Actaeon and Austin, with the formal injunction not to leave them, the woeful Benedict uttered no complaint, but followed in his place, like a blind man led by a string. The little party had not gone 50 steps when old Tom suddenly stopped it with one word. "Dingo," said he. "In fact, Dingo is not here," replied Hercules. The black called the dog several times with his powerful voice. No barking replied to him. Dick Sand remained silent. The absence of the dog was to be regretted, for he had preserved the little party from all surprise. "Could Dingo have followed Harris?" asked Tom. "Harris? No," replied Dick Sand, "but he may have put himself on. Negoro's scent, he felt him in our steps." "This cook of misfortune would quickly end him with a ball," cried Hercules. "Provided Dingo did not first strangle him," replied Bat. "Perhaps so," replied the young novice, "but we cannot wait for Dingo's return. Besides, if he is living, the intelligent animal will know how to find us. Forward." The weather was very warm. Since daybreak large clouds obscured the horizon. Already a storm was threatened in the air. Probably the day would not end without some thunderclaps. Happily the forest, more or less dense, retained a little freshness of the surface of the soil. Here and there great forest trees enclosed prairies covered with a tall, thick grass. In certain spots enormous trunks, already petrified, lay on the ground, indicating the presence of coal mines, which are frequently met with on the African continent. Then, in the clearings, where the green carpet was mingled with some sprigs of roses, the flowers were various in color, yellow and blue ginger plants, pale lobelias, red orchids, incessantly visited by the insects which fertilized them. The trees no longer formed impenetrable masses, but their nature was more varied. There were a kind of palm tree, which gives an oil found only in Africa, cotton trees forming thickets from 8 to 10 feet high, whose wood stalks produce a cotton with long hairs, almost analogous to that of Fernambauch. From the copals there oozes, by the holes which certain insects make, an odorous gum, which runs along the ground and collects for the wants of the natives. Here spread the lemon trees, the grenadiers of a savage condition of a country, and 20 other odorous plants, which prove the prodigious fertility of this plateau of Central Africa. In several places, also, the perfume was agreeably mingled with the tine odor of vanilla, although they could not discover what tree exhaled it. This whole collection of trees and plants was perfectly green, although it was in the middle of the dry season, and only rare storms could water these luxuriant forests. It was then the time for fevers. But, as Livingstone has observed, they can be cured by leaving the place where they have been contracted. Dick Sand knew this remark of the great traveler, and he hoped that little Jack would not contradict it. He told it to Mrs. Weldon, after having observed that the periodical access had not returned as they feared, and that the child slept quietly in Hercules' arms. Thus they went forward carefully and rapidly. Sometimes they discovered traces where men or animals had recently passed. The twisted and broken branches of the brushwood and the thickets afforded an opportunity to walk with a more equal step. But the greater part of the time, numerous obstacles which they had to overcome retarded the little party, to Dick Sand's great disappointment. There were twisted lions that might justly be compared with the disordered rigging of a ship, certain vines similar to bent swords, whose blades were ornamented with long thorns, vegetable serpents, 50 or 60 feet long, which had the faculty of turning to prick the passerby with their sharp spikes. The blacks, hatchet in hand, cut them down with vigorous blows, but the lions reappeared constantly, reaching from the earth to the top of the highest trees which they encircled. The animal kingdom was not less curious than the vegetable kingdom in this part of the province. Birds flew in vast numbers under these powerful branches, but it will be understood that they had no gunshot to fear from the men, who wished to pass as secretly as rapidly. There were guinea fowls in large flocks, heathcocks of various kinds, very difficult to approach, and some of those birds which the Americans of the North have, by onomatopoeia, called whippoorwills, 3 syllables which exactly reproduce their cries. Dick Sand and Tom might truly have believed themselves in some province of the new continent. But alas, they knew what to expect. Until then the deer, so dangerous in Africa, had not approached the little troop. They again saw, in this first halt, some giraffes which Harris had undoubtedly called ostriches. These swift animals passed rapidly, frightened by the apparition of a caravan in these little frequented forests. In the distance, on the edge of the prairie, there arose at times a thick cloud of dust. It was a herd of buffaloes, which galloped with the noise of wagons heavily laden. For 2 miles Dick Sand thus followed the course of the rivulet, which must end in a more important river. He was in haste to confide his companions to the rapid current of one of the coast rivers. He felt sure that the dangers and the fatigue would be much less than on the shore. Towards noon 3 miles had been cleared without any bad incident or meeting. There was no trace of either Harris or Negoro. Dingo had not reappeared. It was necessary to halt to take rest and nourishment. The encampment was established in a bamboo thicket, which completely sheltered the little party. They talked very little during this repast. Mrs. Weldon had taken her little boy in her arms. She could not take her eyes off of him. She could not eat. "You must take some nourishment, Mrs. Weldon," Dick Sand repeated several times. "What will become of you if your strength gives out? Eat, eat. We will soon start again, and a good current will carry us without fatigue to the coast." Mrs. Weldon looked in Dick Sand's face while he thus talked. The young novice's burning eyes spoke of the courage by which he felt animated. In seeing him thus, in observing these brave, devoted blacks, wife and mother, she could not yet despair. And besides, why was she abandoned? Did she not think herself on hospitable ground? Harris's treason could not, in her eyes, have any very serious consequences. Dick Sand read her thought, and he kept his eyes on the ground. Chapter 4. The Bad Roads of Angola. At this moment little Jack awoke and put his arms around his mother's neck. His eyes looked better. The fever had not returned. "You are better, my darling," said Mrs. Weldon, pressing the sick child to her heart. "Yes, mamma," replied Jack, "but I am a little thirsty." They could only give the child some fresh water, of which he drank with pleasure. "And my friend Dick," he said. "Here I am, Jack," replied Dick Sand, coming to take the young child's hand. "And my friend Hercules." "Hercules is here, Mr. Jack," replied the giant, bringing nearer his good face. "And the horse?" demanded little Jack. "The horse, gone, Mr. Jack," replied Hercules. "I will carry you. Will you find that I trot too hard?" "No," replied little Jack, "but then I shall no longer have any bridle to hold." "Oh, you will put a bit in my mouth if you wish," said Hercules, opening his large mouth, "and you may pull back so long as that will give you pleasure." "You know very well that I shall not pull back." "Good, you would be wrong, I have a hard mouth." "But Mr. Harris's farm?" the little boy asked again. "We shall soon arrive there, my Jack," replied Mrs. Weldon. "Yes, soon." "Will we set out again?" then said Dick Sand in order to cut short this conversation. "Yes, Dick, let us go," replied Mrs. Weldon. The camp was broken up, and the march continued again in the same order. It was necessary to pass through the underwood so as not to leave the course of the rivulet. There had been some paths there formerly, but those paths were dead, according to the native expression. That is, brambles and brushwood had usurped them. In these painful conditions, they might spend 3 hours in making 1 mile. The blacks worked without relaxation. Hercules, after putting little Jack back in Nan's arms, took his part of the work, and what a part! He gave stout heaves, making his axe turn round, and a hole was made before them, as if he had been a devouring fire. Fortunately, this fatiguing work would not last. This first mile cleared, they saw a large hole, opened through the underwood which ended obliquely at the rivulet and followed its bank. It was a passage made by elephants, and those animals, doubtless by hundreds, were in the habit of traversing this part of the forest. Great holes, made by the feet of the enormous pachyderms, riddled a soil softened during the rainy season. Its spongy nature also prepared it for those large imprints. It soon appeared that this passage did not serve for those gigantic animals alone. Human beings had more than once taken this route, but as flocks, brutally led to the slaughterhouse, would have followed it. Here and there bones of dead bodies strewed the ground, remains of skeletons, half gnawed by animals, some of which still bore the slaves' fetters. There are in Central Africa long roads thus marked out by human debris. Hundreds of miles are traversed by caravans, and how many unhappy wretches fall by the way, under the agents' whips, killed by fatigue or privations, decimated by sickness. How many more massacred by the traders themselves when food fails? Yes, when they can no longer feed them, they kill them with the gun, with the sword, with the knife. These massacres are not rare. So then, caravans of slaves had followed this road. For a mile, Dick Sand and his companions struck against these scattered bones at each step, putting to flight enormous fern owls. Those owls rose at their approach with a heavy flight and turned round in the air. Mrs. Weldon looked without seeing. Dick Sand trembled lest she should question him, for he hoped to lead her back to the coast without telling her that Harris's treachery had led them astray in an African province. Fortunately, Mrs. Weldon did not explain to herself what she had under her eyes. She had desired to take her child again, and little Jack, asleep, absorbed all her care. Nan walked near her, and neither of them asked the young novice the terrible questions he dreaded. Old Tom went along with his eyes down. He understood only too well why this opening was strewn with human bones. His companions looked to the right, to the left, with an air of surprise, as if they were crossing an interminable cemetery, the tombs of which had been overthrown by a cataclysm. But they passed in silence. Meanwhile, the bed of the rivulet became deeper and wider at the same time. Its current was less impetuous. Dick Sand hoped that it would soon become navigable, or that it would before long reach a more important river, tributary to the Atlantic. Cost what it might, the young novice was determined to follow this stream of water. Neither did he hesitate to abandon this opening, because, as ending by an oblique line, it led away from the rivulet. The little party a second time ventured through the dense underwood. They marched, axe in hand, through leaves and bushes inextricably interlaced. But if this vegetation obstructed the ground, they were no longer in the thick forest that bordered the coast. Trees became rare. Large sheaves of bamboo alone rose above the grass, and so high that even Hercules was not ahead over them. The passage of the little party was only revealed by the movement of these stalks. Toward 3 o'clock in the afternoon of that day, the nature of the ground totally changed. Here were long plains, which must have been entirely inundated in the rainy season. The earth, now more swampy, was carpeted by thick mosses beneath charming ferns. Should it be diversified by any steep ascents, they would see brown hematites appear, the last deposits of some rich vein of mineral. Dick Sand then recalled, and very fortunately, what he had read in Livingstone's travels. More than once the daring doctor had nearly rested in these marshes, so treacherous underfoot. "Listen to me, my friends," said he, going ahead. "Try the ground before stepping on it." "In fact," replied Tom, "they say that these grounds have been softened by the rain. But however, it has not rained during these last days." "No," replied Bat, "but the storm is not far off." "The greater reason," replied Dick Sand, "why we should hurry and get clear of this swamp before it commences. Hercules, take little Jack in your arms. Bat, Austin, keep near Mrs. Weldon so as to be able to help her if necessary. You, Mr. Benedict, why, what are you doing, Mr. Benedict?" "I am falling," innocently replied Cousin Benedict, who had just disappeared as if a trap had been suddenly opened beneath his feet. In fact, the poor man had ventured on a sort of quagmire and had disappeared halfway in the sticky mud. They stretched out their hands, and he rose, covered with slime, but quite satisfied at not having injured his precious entomologist's box. Actaeon went beside him, and made it his duty to preserve the unlucky, nearsighted man from any new disasters. Besides, Cousin Benedict had made rather a bad choice of the quagmire for his plunge. When they drew him out of the sticky earth, a large quantity of bubbles rose to the surface, and in bursting, they emitted some gases of a suffocating odor. Livingstone, who had been sunk up to his chest in the slime, compared these grounds to a collection of enormous sponges, made of black, porous earth, from which numerous streams of water spouted when they were stepped upon. These places were always very dangerous. For the space of half a mile, Dick Sand and his companions must march over this spongy soil. It even became so bad that Mrs. Weldon was obliged to stop, for she sank deep in the mire. Hercules, Bat, and Austin, wishing to spare her the unpleasantness more than the fatigue of a passage across this marshy plain, made a litter of bamboos, on which she consented to sit. Her little Jack was placed in her arms, and they endeavored to cross that pestilential marsh in the quickest manner. The difficulties were great. Actaeon held Cousin Benedict firmly. Tom aided Nan, who, without him, would have disappeared several times in some crevice. The three other blacks carried the litter. At the head, Dick Sand sounded the earth. The choice of the place to step on was not made without trouble. They marched from preference on the edges, which were covered by a thick and tough grass. Often the support failed, and they sank to the knees in the slime. At last, about 5 o'clock in the evening, the marsh being cleared, the soil regained sufficient firmness, thanks to its clayey nature, but they felt it damp underneath. Very evidently these lands lay below the neighboring rivers, and the water ran through their pores. At that time, the heat had become overwhelming. It would even have been unbearable if thick storm clouds had not interposed between the burning rays and the ground. Distant lightnings began to rend the sky, and low rollings of thunder grumbled in the depths of the heavens. A formidable storm was going to burst forth. Now, these cataclysms are terrible in Africa. Rain in torrents, squalls of wind which the strongest trees cannot resist, clap after clap of thunder, such is the contest of the elements in that latitude. Dick Sand knew it well, and he became very uneasy. They could not pass the night without shelter. The plain was likely to be inundated, and it did not present a single elevation on which it was possible to seek refuge. But refuge, where would they seek it in this low desert without a tree, without a bush? The bowels of the earth even would not give it. 2 feet below the surface they would find water. However, toward the north a series of low hills seemed to limit the marshy plain. It was as the border of this depression of land. A few trees were profiled there on a more distant, clearer belt, left by the clouds on the line of the horizon. There, if shelter were still lacking, the little band would at least no longer risk being caught in a possible inundation. There perhaps was salvation for all. "Forward, my friends, forward," repeated Dick Sand. "3 miles more and we shall be safer than in these bottom lands." "Hurry, hurry," cried Hercules. The brave black would have wished to take that whole world in big arms and carry it alone. Those words inspired those courageous men, and in spite of the fatigue of a day's march, they advanced more quickly than they had done at the commencement from the halting place. When the storm burst forth, the end to be attained was still more than 2 miles off. Now, a fact which was the more to be feared, the rain did not accompany the first lightnings exchanged between the ground and the electrical clouds. Darkness then became almost complete, though the sun had not disappeared below the horizon. But the dome of vapors gradually lowered, as if it threatened to fall in, a falling in which must result in a torrent of rain. Lightnings, red or blue, split it in 1,000 places and enveloped the plain in an inextricable network of fire. 20 times Dick and his companions ran the risk of being struck by lightning. On this plateau, deprived of trees, they formed the only projecting points which could attract the electrical discharges. Jack, awakened by the noise of the thunder, hid himself in Hercules' arms. He was very much afraid, poor little boy, but he did not wish to let his mother see it, for fear of afflicting her more. Hercules, while taking great steps, consoled him as well as he could. "Do not be afraid, little Jack," he repeated. "If the thunder comes near us, I will break it in two with a single hand. I am stronger than it." And truly, the giant's strength reassured Jack a little. Meanwhile, the rain must soon fall, and then it would in torrents poured out by those clouds in condensing. What would become of Mrs. Weldon and her companions if they did not find a shelter? Dick Sand stopped a moment near old Tom. "What must be done?" said he. "Continue our march, Mr. Dick," replied Tom. "We cannot remain on this plain that the rain is going to transform into a marsh." "No, Toms, no, but a shelter. Where? What, if it were only a hut?" Dick Sand had suddenly broken off his sentence. A more vivid flash of lightning had just illuminated the whole plain. "What have I seen there a quarter of a mile off?" exclaimed Dick. "Sand." "Yes, I have seen," replied old Tom, shaking his head. "A camp, is it not?" "Yes, Mr. Dick, it must be a camp, but a camp of natives." A new flash enabled them to observe this camp more closely. It occupied a part of the immense plain. There, in fact, rose 100 conical tents, symmetrically arranged and measuring from 12 to 15 feet in height. Not a soldier showed himself, however. Were they then shut up under their tents so as to let the storm pass, or was the camp abandoned? In the first case, whatever heaven should threaten, Dick Sand must flee in the quickest manner. In the second, there was, perhaps, the shelter he asked. "I shall find out," he said to himself, then, addressing old Tom, "stay here, let no one follow me. I shall go to reconnoiter that camp." "Let one of us accompany you, Mr. Dick." "No, Tom, I shall go alone. I can approach without being seen. Stay here." The little troop that followed Tom and Dick Sand halted. The young novice left at once and disappeared in the darkness, which was profound when the lightning did not tear the sky. Some large drops of rain already began to fall. "What is the matter?" asked Mrs. Weldon, approaching the old black. "We have perceived a camp, Mrs. Weldon," replied Tom. "A camp, or perhaps a village, and our captain wished to reconnoiter it before leading us to it." Mrs. Weldon was satisfied with this reply. 3 minutes after, Dick Sand was returning. "Come, come," he cried in a voice which expressed his entire satisfaction. "The camp is abandoned?" asked Tom. "It is not a camp," replied the young novice. "It is not a village. They are anthills." "Anthills?" exclaimed Cousin Benedict, whom that word aroused. "Yes, Mr. Benedict, but anthills 12 feet high at least, and in which we shall endeavor to hide ourselves." "But then," replied Cousin Benedict, "those would be anthills of the warlike termite or of the devouring termite. Only those ingenious insects raise such monuments, which the greatest architects would not disown." "Whether they be termites or not, Mr. Benedict," replied Dick Sand, "we must dislodge them and take their place. They will devour us, they will be defending their rights. Forwards, forward." "But wait now," said Cousin Benedict again. "I thought those anthills only existed in Africa." "Forward," exclaimed Dick Sand, for the last time, with a sort of violence. He was so much afraid that Mrs. Weldon might hear the last word pronounced by the entomologist. They followed Dick Sand with all haste. A furious wind had sprung up. Large drops crackled on the ground. In a few moments the squalls of wind would become unbearable. Soon one of those cones which stood on the plain was reached. No matter how threatening the termites might be, the human beings must not hesitate. If they could not drive the insects away, they must share their abode. At the bottom of this cone, made with a kind of reddish clay, there was a very narrow hole. Hercules enlarged it with his cutlass in a few moments, so as to give a passage even to a man like himself. To Cousin Benedict's extreme surprise, not one of the thousands of termites that ought to occupy the anthill showed itself. Was, then, the cone abandoned? The hole enlarged, Dick and his companions glided into it. Hercules disappeared the last, just as the rain fell with such rage that it seemed to extinguish the lightnings. But those wind squalls were no longer to be feared. A happy chance had furnished this little troop with a solid shelter, better than a tent, better than a native's hut. It was one of those termite cones that, according to Lieutenant Cameron's comparison, are more astonishing than the pyramids of Egypt, raised by the hands of men, because they have been built by such small insects. "It is," said he, "as if a nation had built Mount Everest, the highest mountain of the Himalaya chain." Chapter 5. Ants and Their Dwelling. At this moment the storm burst with a violence unknown in temperate latitudes. It was providential that Dick Sand and his companions had found this refuge. In fact, the rain did not fall in distinct drops, but in streams of various thickness. Sometimes it was a compact mass forming a sheet of water, like a cataract, a Niagara. Imagine an aerial basin containing a whole sea being upset. Under such showers, the ground was hollowed out, the plains were changed to lakes, the streams to torrents, the rivers, overflowing, inundated vast territories. In temperate zones, the violence of the storms decreases according to their duration. But in Africa, however heavy they continue for several entire days. How can so much electricity be collected in the clouds? How can such quantities of vapor be accumulated? It is very difficult to comprehend this. However, such are the facts, and one might suppose himself transported to the extraordinary epochs of the Diluvian period. Fortunately, the ant cone, with its thick walls, was perfectly impervious. A beaver's hut of well-beaten earth could not have been more watertight. A torrent could have passed over it without a single drop of water filtering through its pores. As soon as Dick Sand and his companions had taken possession of the cone, they occupied themselves in examining its interior arrangement. The lantern was lighted, and the anthill was sufficiently illuminated. This cone, which measured 12 feet in height inside, was 11 feet wide, except in its upper part, which rounded in the form of a sugar loaf. Everywhere the walls were about 1 foot in thickness, and there was a distance between the stories of cells which adorned them. We may be astonished at the construction of such monuments, due to these industrious swarms of insects, but it is true that they are frequently found in the interior of Africa. Smeathman, a Dutch traveler of the last century, with 4 of his companions, occupied the top of one of these cones. In the Lound, Livingstone observed several of these anthills, built of reddish clay, and attaining a height of 15 and 20 feet. Lieutenant Cameron has many a time mistaken for a camp these collections of cones which dotted the plain in Enyangwe. He has even stopped at the foot of great edifices, not more than 20 feet high, but composed of 40 or 50 enormous rounded cones, flanked with bell towers like the dome of a cathedral, such as southern Africa possesses. To what species of ant was due, then, the prodigious style of architecture of these cones? To the warlike termite, Cousin Benedict had replied, without hesitating, as soon as he had recognized the nature of the materials employed in their construction. And in fact, the walls, as has been said, were made of reddish clay. Had they been formed of a gray or black alluvian earth, they must have been attributed to the terms mordax or the terms atrox. As we see, these insects have not very cheering names, a fact which cannot but please a strong entomologist such as Cousin Benedict. The central part of the cone, in which the little troop had first found shelter, and which formed the empty interior, would not have contained them. But large cavities, in close contact, made a number of divisions, in which a person of medium height could find refuge. Imagine a succession of open drawers, and at the bottom of those drawers millions of cells which the termites had occupied, and the interior disposition of the anthill is easily understood. To sum up, these drawers are in tiers, like the berths in a ship's cabin. In the upper ones, Mrs. Weldon, little Jack, Nan, and Cousin Benedict took refuge. In the lower row, Austin, Bat, and Actaeon hid themselves. As for Dick Sand, Tom, and Hercules, they remained in the lower part of the cone. "My friends," then said the young novice to the 2 blacks, "the ground is becoming damp. We must fill it up by crumbling the red clay from the base, but take care not to obstruct the hole by which the air enters. We cannot risk being smothered in this anthill." "We have only 1 night to spend here," replied old Tom. "Well, let us try and make it recover us from our fatigue. This is the first time in 10 days that we have not to sleep in the open air." "10 days," repeated Tom. "Besides," added Dick Sand, "as this cone forms a solid shelter, perhaps we had better stay here 24 hours. During that time I will go in search of the stream that we are in need of. It cannot be very distant. I think that until we have constructed our raft, it will be better not to quit this shelter. The storm cannot reach us here. Let us make the floor stronger and drier." Dick Sand's orders were executed at once. Hercules, with his axe, crumbled the first story of cells, which was composed of crisp red clay. He thus raised, more than a foot, the interior part of the swampy earth on which the anthill rested, and Dick Sand made sure that the air could freely penetrate to the interior of the cone through the orifice pierced at its base. It was, certainly, a fortunate circumstance that the anthill had been abandoned by the termites. With a few thousands of these ants, it would have been uninhabitable. But had it been evacuated for some time, or had the voracious Neuroptera but just quitted it? It was not superfluous to ponder this question. Cousin Benedict was so much surprised at the abandonment that he at once considered the reason for it, and he was soon convinced that the emigration had been recent. In fact, he did not wait, but, descending to the lower part of the cone, and taking the lantern, he commenced to examine the most secret corners of the anthill. He thus discovered what is called the general storehouse of the termites, that is to say, the place where these industrious insects lay up the provisions of the colony. It was a cavity hollowed in the wall, not far from the royal cell, which Hercules's labor had destroyed, along with the cells destined for the young larvae. In this storeroom, Cousin Benedict collected a certain quantity of particles of gum and the juices of plants, scarcely solidified, which proved that the termites had lately brought them from without. "Well, no," cried he. "No," as if he were replying to some contradiction. "No, this anthill has not been long abandoned." "Who says to the contrary, Mr. Benedict?" said Dick Sand. "Recently or not, the important thing for us is that the termites have left it, because we have to take their place." "The important thing," replied Cousin Benedict, "will be to know why they have left it. Yesterday, this morning, perhaps, these sagacious Neuroptera were still here because, see these liquid juices, and this evening." "Well, what do you conclude, Mr. Benedict?" asked Dick Sand. "That a secret presentiment has caused them to abandon the cone. Not only have all the termites left their cells, but they have taken care to carry away the young larvae, of which I cannot find one. Well, I repeat that all this was not done without a motive, and that these sagacious insects foresaw some near danger. They foresaw that we were going to invade their dwelling," replied Hercules, laughing. "Indeed," replied Cousin Benedict, whom this answer sensibly shocked. "You think yourself so strong that you would be dangerous to these courageous insects? A few thousand of these Neuroptera would quickly reduce you to a skeleton if they found you dead on the road." "Dead, certainly," replied Hercules, who would not give up, "but living, I could crush masses of them." "You might crush 100,000, 500,000, a million," replied Cousin Benedict with animation, "but not 1,000 millions, and 1,000 millions would devour you, living or dead, to the last morsel." During this discussion, which was less trifling than might be supposed, Dick Sand reflected on the observations made by Cousin Benedict. There was no doubt that the savant knew too much about the habits of the termites to be mistaken. If he declared that a secret instinct warned them to leave the anthill recently, it was because there was truly peril in remaining in it. Meanwhile, as it was impossible to abandon this shelter at a moment when the storm was raging with unparalleled intensity, Dick Sand looked no farther for an explanation of what seemed to be inexplicable, and he contented himself with saying, "Well, Mr. Benedict, if the termites have left their provisions in this anthill, we must not forget that we have brought ours, and let us have supper. Tomorrow, when the storm will be over, we will consult together on our future plans." They then occupied themselves in preparing the evening meal, for, great as their fatigue was, it had not affected the appetite of these vigorous walkers. On the contrary, the food, which had to last for 2 more days, was very welcome. The damp had not reached the biscuits, and for several minutes it could be heard cracking under the solid teeth of Dick Sand and his companions. Between Hercules's jaws it was like grain under the miller's grindstone. It did not crackle, it powdered. Mrs. Weldon alone scarcely eat, and even Dick Sand's entreaties were vain. It seemed to him that this brave woman was more preoccupied, more sad than she had been hitherto. Meanwhile her little Jack suffered less. The fever had not returned, and at this time he was sleeping, under his mother's eyes, in a cell well lined with garments. Dick Sand knew not what to think. It is useless to say that Cousin Benedict did honor to the repast, not that he paid any attention either to the quality or to the quantity of the food that he devoured, but because he had found an opportunity to deliver a lecture in entomology on the termites. Ah, if he had been able to find a termite, a single one, in the deserted ant hill, but nothing. "These admirable insects," said he, without taking the trouble to find out if anyone were listening. "These admirable insects belong to the marvelous order of Neuroptera, whose horns are longer than the head, the jaws very distinct, and whose lower wings are generally equal to the upper ones. 5 tribes constitute this order: the panorpates, scorpion flies, the meiomeleonians, the hemerobins, the termitines, and the perlides. It is useless to add that the insects which now interest us, and whose dwelling we occupy, perhaps unduly, are the termitines." At this moment Dick Sand listened very attentively to Cousin Benedict. Had the meeting with these termites excited in him the thought that he was perhaps on the African continent, without knowing by what chance he had arrived there. The young novice was very anxious to find out. The savant, mounted on his favorite hobby, continued to ride it beautifully. Now these termitines, said he, are characterized by four joints on the instep, horned jaws, and remarkable strength. We have the mantis species, the rhaphidy, and the termite species. The last is often known under the term of white ants, in which we count the deadly termite, the yellow corselet termite, the termite that shuns the light, the biter, the destroyer. And those that constructed this anthill? Asked Dick Sand. They are the martial ants, replied Cousin Benedict, who pronounced this word as if it had been the Macedonians or some other ancient people brave in war. Yes, the warlike ants, and of all sizes. Between Hercules and a dwarf, the difference would be less than between the largest of these insects and the smallest. Among them are workers of 5 millimeters in length, soldiers of 10, and males and females of 20. We find also a kind otherwise very curious. The seraphis half an inch in length, which have pincers for jaws, and a head larger than the body, like the sharks. They are the sharks among insects, and in a fight between some seraphis and a shark, I would bet on the seraphis. And where are these seraphis commonly observed? Then asked Dick Sand. In Africa, replied Cousin Benedict, in the central and southern provinces. Africa is, in fact, the country of ants. You should read what Livingstone says of them in the last notes reported by Stanley. More fortunate than myself, the doctor has witnessed a Homeric battle, joined between an army of black ants and an army of red ants. The latter, which are called drivers, and which the natives name seraphis, were victorious. The others, the T. chaungus, took flight, carrying their eggs and their young, not without having bravely defended themselves. Never, according to Livingstone, never was the spirit of battle carried farther, either among men or beasts. With their tenacious jaws which tear out the peace, these seraphis make the bravest man recoil. The largest animals, even lions and elephants, flee before them. Nothing stops them, neither trees which they climb to the summit, nor streams which they cross by making a suspension bridge of their own bodies hooked together. And numerous, another African traveler, Duchelu, has seen a column of these ants defile past him for 12 hours without stopping on the road. But why be astonished at the sight of such myriads? The fecundity of these insects is surprising, and, to return to our fighting termites, it has been proved that a female deposits as much as 60,000 eggs in a day. Besides, these Neuroptera furnish the natives with a juicy food. Broiled ants, my friends, I know of nothing better in the world. Have you then eaten them, Mr. Benedict? Asked Hercules. Never, replied the wise professor, but I shall eat some. Where? Here. Here we are not in Africa, said Tom very quickly. No, no, replied Cousin Benedict, and thus far these warlike termites and their villages of anthills have only been observed on the African continent. Ah, such travelers, they do not know how to see? Well, all the better after all. I have discovered a tsetse in America. To the glory of this, I shall join that of having found the warlike termites on the same continent. What matter for an article that will make a sensation in educated Europe, and perhaps appear in folio form, with prints and engravings besides the text? It was evident that the truth had not entered Cousin Benedict's brain. The poor man and all his companions, Dick Sand and Tom excepted, believed themselves, and must believe themselves, where they were not. It needed other incidents, facts still more grave than certain scientific curiosities, to undeceive them. It was then 9 o'clock in the morning. Cousin Benedict had talked for a long time. Did he perceive that his auditors, propped up in their cells, had gradually fallen asleep during his entomological lecture? No, certainly not. He lectured for himself. Dick Sand no longer questioned him, and remained motionless, although he did not sleep. As for Hercules, he had resisted longer than the others, but fatigue soon finished by shutting his eyes, and with his eyes his ears. For some time longer Cousin Benedict continued to lecture. However, sleep finally got the best of him, and he mounted to the upper cavity of the cone, in which he had chosen his domicile. Deep silence fell on the interior of the cone, while the storm filled space with noise and fire. Nothing seemed to indicate that the tempest was nearly over. The lantern had been extinguished. The interior of the anthill was plunged in complete darkness. No doubt all slept. However, Dick Sand alone did not seek in sleep the repose which was so necessary to him. Thought absorbed him. He dreamed of his companions, whom he would save at all hazards. The wrecking of the Pilgrim had not been the end of their cruel trials, and others, still more terrible, threaten them should they fall into the hands of these natives. And how to avoid this danger, the worst of all, during their return to the coast. Harris and Negoro had not led them 100 miles into the interior of Angola without a secret design to gain possession of them. But what did this miserable Portuguese intend? Who had merited his hatred? The young novice repeated to himself that he alone had incurred it. Then he passed in review all the incidents that had taken place during the Pilgrim's voyage, the meeting with the wreck and the blacks, the pursuit of the whale, the disappearance of Captain Hull and his crew. Dick Sand had found himself, at the age of 15, entrusted with the command of a vessel, the compass and log of which were soon injured by Negoro's criminal actions. He again saw himself using his authority in the presence of this insolent cook, threatening to put him in irons or to blow out his brains with a pistol shot. Ah, why had he hesitated to do it? Negoro's corpse would have been thrown overboard, and none of these catastrophes would have happened. Such were the young man's various thoughts. Then they dwelt a moment on the shipwreck which had ended the Pilgrim's voyage. The traitor Harris appeared then, and this province of South America gradually became transformed. Bolivia changed to the terrible Angola, with its feverish climate, its savage deer, its natives still more cruel. Could the little party escape during its return to the coast? This river which he was seeking, which he hoped to find, would it conduct them to the shore with more safety, and with less fatigue? He would not doubt it, for he knew well that a march of 100 miles through this inhospitable country, in the midst of incessant dangers, was no longer possible. Happily, he said to himself, Mrs. Weldon and all are ignorant of the danger of the situation. Old Tom and I, we alone are to know that Negoro has thrown us on the coast of Africa, and that Harris has led me into the wilds of Angola. Dick Sand was thus sunk in overpowering thoughts, when he felt a breath on his forehead. A hand rested on his shoulder, and a trembling voice murmured these words in his ear. I know all, my poor Dick, but God can yet save us. His will be done. Chapter 6. The Diving Bell. To this unexpected revelation, Dick Sand could not reply. Besides, Mrs. Weldon had gone back at once to her place beside little Jack. She evidently did not wish to say any more about it, and the young novice had not the courage to detain her. Thus Mrs. Weldon knew what to believe. The various incidents of the way had enlightened her also, and perhaps, too, that word, Africa, so unluckily pronounced the night before by Cousin Benedict. Mrs. Weldon knows everything, repeated Dick Sand to himself. Well, perhaps it is better so. The brave woman does not despair. I shall not despair either. Dick Sand now longed for day to return, that he might explore the surroundings of this termite village. He must find a tributary of the Atlantic with a rapid course to transport all his little troop. He had a presentiment that this watercourse could not be far distant. Above all, they must avoid an encounter with the natives, perhaps already sent in pursuit of them under Harris's and Negoro's direction. But it was not day yet. No light made its way into the cone through the lower orifice. Rumblings, rendered low by the thickness of the walls, indicated that the storm still raged. Listening, Dick Sand also heard the rain falling with violence at the base of the anthill. As the large drops no longer struck a hard soil, he must conclude that the whole plain was inundated. It must have been about 11 o'clock. Dick Sand then felt that a kind of torpor, if not a true sleep, was going to overcome him. It would, however, be rest. But just as he was yielding to it, the thought came to him that, by the settling of the clay, washed in, the lower orifice was likely to be obstructed. All passage for the outer air would be closed. Within, the respiration of 10 persons would soon vitiate the air by loading it with carbonic acid. Dick Sand then slipped to the ground, which had been raised by the clay from the first floor of cells. That cushion was still perfectly dry, and the orifice entirely free. The air penetrated freely to the interior of the cone, and with it some flashes of lightning, and the loud noises of that storm, that a diluvian rain could not extinguish. Dick Sand saw that all was well. No immediate danger seemed to menace these human termites, substituted for the colony of Neuroptera. The young novice then thought of refreshing himself by a few hours' sleep, as he already felt its influence. Only with supreme precaution, Dick Sand lay on that bed of clay, at the bottom of the cone, near the narrow edifice. By this means, if any accident happened outside, he would be the first to remark it. The rising day would also awaken him, and he would be ready to begin the exploration of the plain. Dick Sand lay down then, his head against the wall, his gun under his hand, and almost immediately he was asleep. How long this drowsiness lasted he could not tell. when he was awakened by a lively sensation of coolness. He rose and recognized, not without great anxiety, that the water was invading the ant hill, and even so rapidly that in a few seconds it would reach the story of cells occupied by Tom and Hercules. The latter, awakened by Dick Sand, were told about this new complication. The lighted lantern soon showed the interior of the cone. The water had stopped at a height of about 5 feet and remained stationary. "What is the matter, Dick?" asked Mrs. Weldon. "It is nothing," replied the young novice. "The lower part of the cone has been inundated. It is probably that during this storm, a neighboring river has overflowed on this plain." "Good," said Hercules. "That proves the river is there." "Yes," replied Dick Sand, "and it will carry us to the coast. Be reassured then, Mrs. Weldon, the water cannot reach you, nor little Jack, nor Nan, nor Mr. Benedict." Mrs. Weldon did not reply. As to the cousin, he slept like a veritable termite. Meanwhile, the blacks, leaning over this sheet of water, which reflected the lantern's light, waited for Dick Sand to indicate to them what should be done. He was measuring the height of the inundation. After having the provisions and arms put out of the reach of the inundation, Dick Sand was silent. "The water has penetrated by the orifice," said Tom.